Thank you so much for the kind invitation. I'm really glad to be here, and I already told just now I'm working in a think tank now, so I'm used to having like 5 minutes, 10 minutes to present to policymakers, and it's so good to be in an academic environment where you can put a bit of nuance. I mean, it's a good exercise sometimes to put stuff in just a few words, but there's also some shades of gray that you cannot capture in 5 minutes. So I'm really glad to be back in an academic context here and introduce actually my new book, which is based on my PhD studies. And looking forward and really interested to hear what you think about it. So let me maybe introduce you a little bit to sort of the general framework of the book, and then also, of course, a bit the methods, the sources, how I arrive at the conclusions that I come across, and then, of course, the implications a bit. And as you just said, Bertel, I will also touch a bit upon does that help us in any way to understand what we're seeing at the moment with Russia and China? So let me say this. Xi Jinping's China, I think, is something we've, of course, all very carefully watching. What is Xi Jinping making of this country? We read, of course, already before Xi Jinping, that China is growing in its international power. Its international cloud is becoming more and more present. So the question is sort of, what can we expect? Does China have sort of any global ambitions? And I think before Xi Jinping, many believed it's essentially that China wants to grow. We were speculating, but at the same time, China was, not always portraying its ambitions so much. And under Xi Jinping, I think some would call this a more aggressive foreign policy. But certainly sort of the question has become more apparent. China has become much more active, proactive, however you want to qualify this. And the question here is, of course, that I try to address in this book, is China sort of a global leader from within the system? So is China just trying to advance its own position within the existing system? I think what speaks to this is that China has benefited enormously from the existing institutional framework, that it has also underlined that fact, and that even when it invents new institutions, let's talk, for example, about the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, that they don't necessarily look all completely different from the institutions we know. But as well, of course, you could also say China may also challenge the existing institutions, may challenge the way we see, we practice, and we think about international affairs. It could sort of challenge that. And if that's the case, then probably sort of, if we just listen to what Xi Jinping and the CCP leadership says, then probably what is important is sort of the element of state sovereignty, state control. So to some extent, what this book tries to look at is sort of, is China really credibly advocating a return to a more Westphalian international order and Westphalian world? Or is China sort of so invested in the existing institutional framework that may also not make the state irrelevant, but transform the role of the state in international affairs? So what's really the role of the state in China's foreign policy, and how will its foreign policy sort of impact the role of the state? That is the core question that this book tries to assess. The starting point is sort of the question not just of rhetoric. Of course, I do investigate also how China positions itself in sort of strategic speeches. But it's also looking sort of at the practices and the justification. So it's looking sort of, it scales it one step down. China can say a lot in white papers or in general speeches in front of the United Nations General Assembly, or in whatever format, at the World Economic Forum in Davos or wherever. But sort of, what is China actually doing in concrete decisions, in concrete cases? And then how is it also explaining itself to the world in those concrete cases? And sort of the underlying assumption is that it would be very helpful for China's ambitions if there was at least a minimum of consistency between what it claims to do and what it actually does. Because otherwise, in the eyes of the world, those words become pretty empty and pretty meaningless. Then you just make up a nice speech, but it doesn't have any consequence, and people don't listen and don't believe to you anymore. The idea here is as well that sort of contradictions are in general the rule rather than the exception in the foreign policies of states around the world. So I'm not claiming China is extremely exceptional when it's contradictory or when there are tensions between different policies it does. But it takes it really from sort of China's current position in the world. And I argue, so for a rising power that is likely to have enormous influence in the near future, uncertainty will impact its role in international affairs, the role it plays in the eyes of the international community, and how it reacts to that rising power, in this case, China. Now, is China's foreign policy contradictory? You may, from the title of the book, already guess my conclusions, but let's consider a couple of fields. I don't want to just put that as a given and not justify it. Let's consider sort of 3 cases that I also investigate in this book a bit. Let's start with sort of, I think, the most momentous change in the discussion about how to conceptualize international security, which in my view is the responsibility to protect, even though we don't use that terminology that much anymore. I think particularly after 2011, the credibility of that concept seemed to have suffered a lot after the war in Libya and a lot of pushback against that concept. But I think it's still around sort of in other ways. Interestingly, for some reason, I forgot to put that chart into the slides here. But if you look at the United Nations Security Council resolutions that reference the responsibility to protect, interestingly, that has gone up after 2011 and not down. It has referenced the RTP in certain ways and not in others. So I would say we can also see sort of a shift in how the RTP is conceptualized. So it's not the exact same debate we had before 2011, but the concept as such, as a whole, I think has not disappeared altogether. It may have sort of disappeared from our general debates and from our perspectives, but it's still there if you look at international practices. China has adopted from the start a very skeptic position to the responsibility to protect, arguing that the territorial integrity, non-interference are really foundational and very crucial elements of international affairs, of international law. But interestingly, it has also never outright rejected the idea of the responsibility to protect that would condition sovereignty and sort of placing a responsibility of states to protect their people from mass atrocities. And then also, if you look at specific cases, China has not acted consistently. So for example, in 2011, the case I've just referenced, the war in Libya, China has agreed actually to enact the responsibility to protect in United Nations Security Council Resolution 1970 that transferred the case of mass atrocities in Libya to the International Criminal Court, which I think is in itself already quite remarkable, since China has not ratified the Rome Statute of that same court. You can say it's also remarkable the United States agreed to that, since the US has also not ratified the Rome Statute. But let's stick to China here, and I think that is one. And also, of course, even more prominently, Resolution 1973, where China abstained, that allowed not all of NATO, but some NATO states plus a few other allies of those states to bombard Libya, which led ultimately to regime change in Libya. And then later that same year, but even more so in 2012 and following years, there were discussions of whether to introduce RTP language that wouldn't go as far as to mandate a foreign intervention into Syria in the context of the Syrian civil war, also in Security Council resolutions. And here, China cast almost always, in very few exceptions where there was really just very minor references to the RTP, then it was also willing to abstain or even to vote yes. But in most substantial cases, China cast a veto, which becomes even more remarkable if you look at China's voting behavior in the Security Council historically, and you see that most of its vetoes to this day it has ever cast in the Security Council were in that specific case in Syria that is not a core interest of China. So how come China has neither sort of rejected the norm in general and also not its application in Libya, but remains skeptical and has also gone against sort of even minor sort of insertion of that language in the Syrian civil war? Let's consider another field, the field of law, authority, what Max Weber has called Herrschaft. And the question, is China willing to sort of to accept limits of international law to the exercise of rule and authority in its own territory? There's not many cases to sort of look at that could potentially limit China's ability to rule its own country, but there is a treaty between the United Kingdom and China, which is the Sino-British Joint Declaration on Hong Kong, that provides, though a vague, but it provides a framework for 50 years after 1997, after the handover of the former Crown colony from Britain to China, and how China can exercise rule over Hong Kong. What is interesting is that this treaty very generally offers promises a high degree of autonomy to Hong Kong, but it also establishes that China's sovereignty over Hong Kong should be undivided, which is again a weird construct. So if you like, China has full sovereignty, but it doesn't have the right to exercise full sovereignty over the city for 50 years. And that is captured then in the phrase "one country, two systems" that Deng Xiaoping had initially invented for Taiwan, but then applied it to Hong Kong. And also, if you look at the implementation of the promises made to Hong Kong, you find some inconsistencies. Let's consider two articles of the Basic Law that was also promised under the Sino-British Joint Declaration to sort of serve as a domestic law implementing the Sino-British Joint Declaration. One article is 23 that covers national security legislation, and it says that Hong Kong is obliged to locally legislate a national security law that protects the legitimate security concerns of the sovereign of China in the special administrative region of Hong Kong, and then gives also even a bit more details what that entails. And then there's Article 45 that promises that the ultimate goal of political reform in Hong Kong would be the democratization of the election of the chief executive, which is like the mayor or the president of. It's a very important, the most important political position in Hong Kong. Interestingly, until this day, Hong Kong has never enacted Article 23. So it has not fulfilled, if you like, its constitutional duty. And there has even been made only one attempt in 2003 to do that. And after mass protests on the streets of Hong Kong, that law was withdrawn from the parliament again. So it was never voted upon. Article 45, so the democratic reform, I think there would have been quite some room for compromise in my view. There have been made many proposals, but we have never, like there, Hong Kong, the Chinese central government has never sort of allowed for any substantial compromise to be made. So while China until very long was sort of compromising on a national security law in Hong Kong, it was not compromising whatsoever on democratic reform. So it has, again, had a very different interpretation how to apply the one country, two systems principle. Of course, that has been resolved in a very unfortunate way, in my view, and I guess in all of our views, in 2020, when China, the central authorities, actually imposed a national security law on Hong Kong, which is even against Article 23. China claims that this does not replace national security law under Article 23 to sort of legitimize its own approach to that subject. So it got sort of, this contradiction kind of got resolved. I would not say that there's different shades of gray anymore when it comes to Hong Kong. But until 2020, or let's say until 2019, I think we see a very inconsistent approach again to how to implement the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And finally, a third field, in the field of economics or welfare, you can see I've discussed implementation of obligations made under World Trade Law following the accession to the World Trade Organization. And we see, on the one hand, many people claiming that China has a high compliance ratio with WTO law, but you also read characterizations of China as being a spoiler of the system. I don't want to go into detail. I think there is reason for both claims, actually, which again, I think, points to a real contradiction in China's policy. And again, here I pick up two cases. One is China's approach to commitments it has made to open up its banking sector, something that has essentially never happened. If it had so, I think we would see a completely different allocation of resources, and thereby, I guess, also a quite different economic system in China. But at the same time, if you look at the compliance ratio with dispute settlement body rulings against China, that has been remarkably high compared to other WTO members, both developing countries and developed countries. DSB is the dispute settlement body of the judiciary essentially of the WTO, which is also remarkable because that has been sort of the first international judiciary China has explicitly agreed to accept, and I think it's quite remarkable that it has such a good compliance record. What is also interesting is that we see in those two cases reverse trends. So while China's approach to the WTO criteria when it comes to the banking sector are over time getting a bit better and better, so we see a liberalization trend here, the compliance record with dispute settlement body rulings is worsening over time. Now, what do I do in this book with this contradiction? I try to explain, or I try to sort of trace how these inconsistencies or contradictions come about. And then, of course, I try to sort of assess what that implies in terms of sort of uncertainties and what it means for the international order. But let's sort of stick first and foremost to this first part of it, sort of the tracing the contradictions, trying to understand what's happening here and why it happens. And here, what I do in terms of sort of methods and materials, it's quite a lot of qualitative content analysis of policy documents, speeches, state-run media, think tank publications. So essentially, whatever in the public domain you could find on those specific cases, but also then, and I think that's where sort of the real meat come to the bones. A content analysis of more than 150 in-depth interviews with different party state officials that I had the chance to interview over the course of several years. Many of them I met several times, so that I would not count the first meeting we had as an interview, but rather, well, I would say on average, maybe the third meeting we had was actually then substantial enough to say, well, this accounts for an interview. It is, if you like, an ethnographic study, not ethnographic in the sense that I was present when the Chinese took certain decisions. Of course, I wasn't part of those institutions. So I wasn't sort of a participant observer, if you like, of the decisions that I study. But it's an ethnographic study in the sense that I've been speaking to people who have been directly involved in those decisions or have been very close to those that have been involved in trying to sort of bring a piece to the puzzle. Of course, this book also doesn't enlighten us to the extent that you understand now the full picture of how Chinese foreign policy is being made, but it hopes to contribute to sort of a growing literature that looks into the institutions and the political economy of China to understand sort of what's behind it. Now, what are the findings? Now we may come to that part that is hopefully most interesting. The first is, I think, that many of those dynamics that we see arising, those decisions and how China comes about them, comes from a mixture of sort of growing or the duality of growing confidence in its own strength and its own power, but also coupled with a persistent and continuing acknowledgement and I would even say sometimes maybe even fear of vulnerabilities. So not confident enough that the strength will be lasting, but very much considering always sort of what potentially stands also in the CCP's way. And that brings us very closely and very directly, I think, to a second element, and this is that much of what China is doing relates back to issues of how the CCP can legitimize itself domestically, how its foreign policy, what the implications of its foreign policy are domestically, and what that means for one-party rule. And here I see mainly two sources of legitimacy. I think that's also not groundbreaking to say, but I find that sort of different actors within the party state have different understandings of those sources of legitimacy. One is national pride, so very much sort of following that line of argument that China has suffered from the century of humiliation for a long time until the mid-20th century when the Chinese Communist Party grew to power. Then Mao sort of unified the country, Deng Xiaoping made it rich again, and now Xi Jinping is there to put China sort of again at the center, at the top of international affairs, make it a global power again. But then the question is, what does that imply? And there's two interpretations of that. One sort of has sort of a more moderate understanding of what Chinese place in the world means in terms of saying China is being once again a respected great power, and that respect also comes with the need to relate to others, to have a good reputation, to be a reliable and responsible great power. So that is sort of very cautious of the international community's perception of China. And the second is a more nationalist interpretation, a more aggressive one, that essentially says, well, we are strong again, we are powerful again, so no one can stumble upon us, no one can ignore our interests, we can push through. This is not to say that those cannot combine or align in some circumstances, but there are some tensions, of course, between these two interpretations of national pride. The second element of legitimization is economic performance, sort of trying to continue the social contract between the party and the people that has lasted for the last few decades, essentially saying, well, we remain in power, but we'll make sure there's a constant growth of prosperity and you'll all profit from it. But the question then is, given that China is in an economic transformation, trying to move up the global value chain, being more innovative, not competing with others essentially on labor cost, but on quality, or as well on quality at least, the question is, of course, how to generate that economic performance. Is that primarily still export-oriented integration into the world, or is it a more protectionist, or now you could also say more self-reliant approach, trying to disentangle to some extent, at least, from the world, and sort of what's the mix of integration and disentanglement from the world. And again, these are tensions that don't necessarily need to contradict each other in each and every case, but it's sort of generally different directions. So the question, so everyone I sort of spoke to, it was clear that national pride and economic performance are crucial elements of CCP legitimation, and they would try to contribute to that. But they were not always quite agreeing on what that actually means, how to achieve economic performance or how to further national pride. Now, let me give you a couple of examples maybe here, how that played out. And I brought for the sort of tensions between national pride. In national pride legitimation, I brought here 2 quotes from the case study of the responsibility to protect, where you can see that in the first quote that I'm going to read out to you in a minute, you see that there's really enormous importance attributed to the international perception of China's position, and it tries to avoid to be isolated in international affairs and in the international community, where one of my interviewees said, in Libya, basically, all the regional powers agreed that the Security Council had to take action against Gaddafi. But how can we interfere in the regional dynamics of the Middle East, in Syria, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Iraq? All these countries tell us to do different things. And there were other quotes where you could also see that they were very cautious if they would be the only ones casting a veto in the Security Council. So whenever primarily Russia would be stepping up and also casting a veto, the Chinese would feel much more at ease to do the same, follow someone else, than being sort of the one stepping forward and hindering something that seemed to be quite consensual in the international community. And I think that may be just one quote that sort of reflects that there was actually a real concern about how others perceive China. But then you see the second quote, where you can rather see that China thinks it acts from a position of strength. It looks back at its own experience of the century of humiliation, and it is sort of very much pushing back against West and Western interests, where someone had said here, how can anyone justify us suffering from Western imperialism today at the beginning of the 21st century? Our co-leader Xi Jinping is leading the country to international glory again. Now, let me also give you from another case study sort of some quotes that capture these tensions within the economic performance legitimation. And here the first quote, I think, is very much sort of addressing potential concerns that international financial markets could have. You have other cases where it's also about trade partners, etc. So sort of the economic consequences of dissatisfying others, or sort of the economic consequences of action that is not well perceived by the international community, where one of my interviews here said, just imagine if we sent the People's Armed Police into Hong Kong to crack down on the protests. I am afraid we would see capital flight the next day with disastrous consequences for our domestic economy and social stability. So really concerned how international economic actors would sort of react to such an action. And the second quote you see is sort of considering the need of economic self-interests of local allies, economic elites in Hong Kong that it really relies on. So a very different perspective where one said, and I should maybe say, we talked a bit about housing and welfare issues. That was also in the context where this interview essentially claimed that plenty of the protests may be in favor of democratic values, but also were, to some extent at least, responding to increasing social grievances in the city. And where he made this claim that, well, we would like to actually solve this, but said, our problem is that we need the support of a few real estate developers that have almost monopolized access to land and keep it scarce. we would like to meet the people's demands, but we cannot. And the reason he gave this quote was a bit long, so I couldn't wouldn't want to display it here all, is that these real estate developers are essentially those local allies that are important for Hong Kong, for Beijing to establish its rule and keep up its rule in Hong Kong. So it essentially said, well, I can't just go against the economic interests of those particular local elites that support Beijing. The third general finding is that those different elements of legitimization in China are also reflected in the institutional structure of the party state. So it's not just that those discourses are somewhere out there, but they're also reflected in what I call here a fragmented polity, so a fragmented institutional framework in a centralized party state. So again, I'm not neglecting, of course, that Xi Jinping is probably the most powerful president of China in a long time. But I still sort of see that, of course, he cannot sit with each and every detail, with each and every decision. And that's where, again, plenty of institutions come in. Those institutions can come from the party, they can come from the state. And I mean, I guess most of you know, in many cases, the very same person may be the party secretary and say the provincial leader, or the party secretary and the mayor of a city, but that does not always need to fall together. So sometimes you have sort of parallel structures. It is clear that the party always takes premise over state institutions, without doubt, but the fact that you have the dual structure sometimes also creates some frictions here. You have a very strong dynamic between local party state and central party state, where you do still find local party leaders saying, well, and I'll bring some quotes, so I don't need to go too much into detail here at this point, but where you find sort of still local party officials saying, well, we have common interests, but it doesn't always mean we need to implement everything literally as it comes from Beijing. And you have plenty of ministries, plenty of agencies, public agencies, financial regulators that have their different mandates, also what they're supposed to do, and also they're therefore pushing for different elements. And I'd even say, and that I think is a very specific aspect, state-owned enterprise, but also people I call red capitalists, so private entrepreneurs with extremely close linkages to the party state. And as I said, this multitude of actors have different perspectives on the legitimation side that I've explained, but they also have divergent material interests. And let me give you again sort of some examples here from case studies. From the WTO maybe, one quote that essentially highlights again that local leaders may have a very different agenda than what we know from Beijing, where one local party official told me, my duty as a local party official is to serve my county, not to adhere to some abstract rules hammered out by Beijing with foreigners at the WTO. This is what the people expect, otherwise they will protest. Nobody in Beijing wants to see social unrest. So he even sort of circles back in the end and says, I'm not even acting against Beijing's interests if I don't take them literally, and if I don't just implement what Beijing says. We all have sort of an interest in keeping the country stable, but that may not mean that I'm always following what the central party state leadership has negotiated. And then, of course, you also sort of see others claiming that, yes, local party state officials may have sort of some leeway when they can act, but if the central leadership is really sort of united in its stance, then it's getting quite difficult. So sort of highlighting the importance, of course, also of the central leadership. And the quote here is, I believe that if the central leadership was united on that subject, the local level could not prevent reform, but we have a history as a planned economy, and the institutional legacy is still very influential. That was very much sort of on economic liberalization, a discussion, and there this interview essentially claimed, well, we have also in the central party state people who don't want to see reform. Now, let me maybe also give you one example for material self-interest, because so far I think I have been mostly referring to cases where you could see that there's also just different mandates and different perspectives. So maybe one that was more sort of from a utilitarian perspective, but that is of course very much highlighting self-interest of local party officials. When I asked one of my interviewees, you mentioned that your hometown owns state-owned enterprises in other parts of the country, which are hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers away. Why is that the case? Because it didn't make sense. If those state-owned enterprises create employment in other parts of the country, why would a city need to own that state-owned enterprise? And the answer is that he laughed and said, yes, you are certainly right, but the party official wants to go on vacation in the beautiful parts of our country, so they go to visit the city-owned companies when they want to go on vacations, and the company pays for it. And I asked whether they cannot afford to travel, and he said, yes, they can, but maybe not the 5-star hotel with the pool and everything. And I should maybe also add from other interviews I had, maybe sometimes they can pay for it, but of course they enjoy if they don't have to do this by themselves. Now, how do sort of these internal dynamics that we as China watchers may or may not find interesting actually are relevant for international affairs, which is also the subject that I'm coming from. Sort of, let's look sort of at what are the implications beyond China. And here I'd say that the general findings sort of translate into external behavior of China by two what I call modes of action. One is an instrumental approach to law, and the other is what I call a redefinition of core vocabulary. And that is closely interlinked. So China on the international stage, of course, diplomats and representatives of China are very well aware of what they're sitting on, all the diversity, all the different perspectives, the different interests. So what they need to, and also very well aware of sort of all the vulnerabilities they need to take into account. What they want to do is that international law is not necessarily constraining them, but rather serves as sort of a tool for them to respond to it. It is that they try to have as much flexibility as possible to react to what is happening domestically. And when I say redefinition of vocabulary, I also mean, again, trying to achieve as much flexibility as possible by being able to bend or even redefine core terms in international affairs. And I'll show you in a second what I mean. First, an example on the instrumental approach to law or international law, where I have a quote here from Hong Kong, and someone, in this case not saying, but writing in the white paper, The Practice of One Country, Two Systems Policy from 2014, the fact that the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress exercises the power of interpretation of the basic law in accordance with the law is aimed at maintaining the rule of law in Hong Kong, as it oversees the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region's implementation of the basic law and protects the high degree of autonomy of the region. While that may sound sort of very technocratic, what it essentially means, I mean, we need to sort of see what are we talking about here. The Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, an essentially political institution, is the one that interprets the basic law to uphold the rule of law. So it's not an independent judiciary, it is a political institution in Beijing that this quote claims is upholding the rule of law in Hong Kong. I think it demonstrates very clearly a very different understanding of what law is there for. It is a tool of the powerful. It is not there to constrain the powerful and to provide sort of a basis of legal predictability here. And then the redefinition of vocabulary, of core vocabulary. Here I have two examples, one from the WTO, one from the Responsibility to Protect. One interviewee told me, free trade enables the free flow and exchange of goods and services for the benefit of all. If we fully opened our market tomorrow, we would suffer massively. This would not benefit all. On the contrary, it would harm all. If you like, we need free trade with Chinese characteristics. And I think this is just indicative of so many situations where Chinese officials told me, well, yes, we like that general concept, but you need to take into account the specific circumstances, and given the circumstances, you need to interpret them differently. But that, of course, sort of empties out the words. If you always need to look at context, if you don't know what free trade means unless you know the context, then the question is, how reliable is it that we know when we talk about free trade that we actually mean the same? And in the second quote here, it is terrible when people are killed, but it is equally terrible when people are starving to death only because the West has defined human rights in a certain way. You guys believe that everyone should follow this definition and intervene. That was obviously in the case of the RTP, where someone said, well, why don't we intervene in countries where people are starving to death? Is that any better than people suffering from mass atrocities? Again, an attempt to sort of say, you have a certain approach to human rights, we have it, but why do you think that that is necessarily a universal one? You could also frame it in very different terms. Now, what do I sort of conclude from all this sort of for international relations most broadly? I don't see that China is developing an alternative vision of international order. I don't see, I mean, I'm on purpose not using the term liberal international order, because then we could debate whether it is liberal or not, what we have at the moment, but I'll leave that for others to decide. But I don't think we see sort of a similar idea about institution building, about laws, about how we could construct principles that govern the international system. But I do see that existing rules, institution, and also trust that those sort of institutions actually build are undermined by the very fact that for domestic reasons, for the reasons of domestic vulnerabilities, China tries to reserve flexibility, tries to redefine vocabulary, or tries to sort of undercut established vocabulary and definitions of that vocabulary to sort of see that it can bend and fit it according to its current situations. And that, of course, raises the effects of power. If not institutions are guiding, if not rules are guiding, then it's those that can actually push through their interpretations in a specific situation, and that gives sort of rise to power again as the decisive sort of currency in international affairs. I want to also sort of say that the fact that I very much highlight that China is acting very much out of a situation where it's very well aware of its vulnerabilities is by no means better for Europe or the rest of the world, because it also means we have less and less impact on what China is doing. A confident China that is essentially playing a game in the international arena, we can think how we can influence this and whether we can influence China's calculations, to what extent we can do that. But if this is about domestic vulnerabilities, it gets quite difficult to see sort of how we could address them. Maybe there are cases where we can take that into consideration and where our action has implications on China's domestic vulnerabilities. But if it was a game that was primarily played in international affairs, that would have probably be much easier for us. Now, do I say that this must sound extremely unfamiliar to anyone who studies democratic states? No. Of course, we face all the time fragmented policies, polities. We face that also democratic leaders around the globe consider domestic affairs. Maybe one of the findings in this book is that China may be less exceptional than it very often claims itself. A lot of what we see in China is very familiar to observers of international affairs. Now, finally, I promised I would also make some comments what that implies and whether it helps us in any way to understand what is happening with China and Russia at the moment. Obviously, this book was finished long before the Russia war broke out, so it's not reflected in the book. But do the lessons that I draw from in this book help us in any way understand what's happening here? And I think they do. During the first days, it was quite remarkable, during the first days after the invasion, I think it was quite remarkable that you could see very different signs coming from Beijing. Some kept emphasizing sort of the right of any sovereign state to defend itself. So it seemed there was no wholehearted support for the Russian invasion. And then, of course, there was also signs and expressions from Beijing where you could see, well, Beijing is actually standing on the side of Russia. Some, I think, some colleagues of mine have described that as pro-Russian neutrality. So trying to sort of somehow stay out, but leaning towards Russia. And I think that is best explained if we look at sort of the situation, how it looks from Beijing's perspective. We do see sort of on the one hand, quite an aggressive nationalist interest that fuels geopolitical interest, that looks at the situation through a geopolitical lens, where essentially it is about China against the United States. And the question is, what does that conflict, that war means for this confrontation? And in that context, you would say, well, a Russia that is more isolated and stands even closer at China's side is probably beneficial from that geopolitical viewpoint. And additionally, a defeat of Russia would certainly not be in the geopolitical interest of China. But at the same time, you had economic interests at stake, be it trade, be it technology cooperation with the West, which resulted in what I would see as mostly a passive China that was still searching for its position and thereby essentially tolerating what Russia was doing. Over the course of the first few weeks, I think you could really see that a premise of this geopolitical calculations took effect, and China started also to spread the Russian narrative, and I think you could then see clearer and clearer that China was more and more adapting to sort of the Russian perspective. Now, also in China's rhetoric, I think you find something of the stuff that I talked about. China has continuously emphasized the importance of territorial integrity and the importance of the UN Charter, and that it is the one defending it. But you could also see that China gave a caveat to that, saying, well, but there's also, of course, special concerns in the region. You need to take into consideration regional stability, regional security concerns, and thereby, of course, implying NATO enlargement to the east was to some extent threatening that stability. And even though sovereign state may have applied for it, that is endangering a situation that seems to make up for an exception for territorial integrity and the sovereignty to take also decisions of forming alliances enshrined in the UN Charter. So again, sort of a try to essentially give it a twist, give its commitment to the UN Charter a specific twist. Now, is it all the same like 5 years ago or even more? Certainly not. I think with Xi Jinping adopting the dual circulation strategy that I think he will even double down on after the Russia war, I think we see that sort of, well, maybe not full decoupling, but more disentanglement, economic disentanglement will take root. So I think we do see a shift. And of course, we also see a centralization trend that has continued after I finished my book. I still think while we may see sort of shifts in China's behavior, I still would claim that we have always seen that historically, if we look over the last few decades, that there were periods of more integration and then others of more disintegration, periods of centralization and decentralization, and then again re-centralization. And I do still think that sort of those tensions are still at play, even if waves go sort of up and down with preferences for either of the different elements. And here I stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you.